Hi, I'm Donald Fischer, co-founder and CEO of Tidelift, and welcome to Upstream. So why are we holding an event called Upstream? And why are we doing it now? Well, the word upstream has a dual meaning. The first meaning of upstream is a term of art used in open source communities to describe where the original authors of software are creating it. It's a natural choice since today we're here to celebrate open source software and specifically the maintainers behind it. And today, you're going to hear from many of those open source maintainers as well as their downstream users. And we're also going to share the results of our first ever Tidelift maintainer survey. But there's a second meaning to the word upstream, one that's articulated in this recent New York Times best-selling book by Dan Heath. In the book, Dan talks about the concept of upstream thinking, which is really a way of thinking about problem solving that's being applied in a whole bunch of different areas, including healthcare and other fields. And this got me thinking, maybe we can cross-pollinate some of the ideas from this meaning of upstream into our open source communities. So what is upstream thinking? It's another way of saying root cause analysis, really. And upstreamists, the people who practice upstream thinking, they look to solve problems at the source rather than just treating downstream symptoms. While learning more about this topic, I came across a TED Talk by upstreamist Dr. Rishi Manchanda. Based in Los Angeles, Dr. Manchanda is applying upstream thinking to health problems in underserved communities. And while watching his talk, I found myself drawing parallels to the challenges that he faces in that healthcare context to those that we face in open source software communities. So we invited Dr. Manchanda to talk about his approach to upstream thinking here today. After his remarks, I'm going to share some thoughts on how we might apply the upstream thinking approach to open source software. But in the meantime, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rishi Manchanda.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Rishi Manchanda. I'm CEO at Health Begins, and I just want to say thank you to everybody at Tidelift for the opportunity to join you guys today. I want to share with you some of my thoughts about the power of upstream thinking. These are lessons I've learned in health and in healthcare after many years of working as a primary care doctor, as a public health trained physician, especially working in some of the most historically marginalized communities in the US, whether it's families working in South Central Los Angeles or homeless veterans or farm workers in the Central Valley of California. The lessons I want to share with you today are actually lessons that I've learned. I hope they resonate with you as you think about the open source software community, and I really look forward to your questions during this time. So let me start by just doing what I do in medicine, which is to talk about not just vague concepts, but to first just bring this home by talking about a patient. And I'll use this to kind of help illustrate the power of upstream thinking as I see it. This is Mrs. M. She's a woman in her mid-40s. She cares for her two children. She cares for her mother. She's a really proud both mom and a proud daughter. Her own mom has recently become quite ill and moved in with her. So Mrs. M is also a caregiver now. She happens to have type 2 diabetes. Mrs. M, both not just her mom's conditions, but her own condition. She has type 2 diabetes and some other medical issues. Unfortunately, her blood sugar levels are a little bit higher than they should be, so her diabetes is not well controlled. She doesn't earn a lot of money. She has a really high deductible health plan, and she spends quite a bit of her money that she does have on out-of-pocket healthcare costs. And that's in addition to rent and utilities and other things that she's taking care of, including medications for her mom, et cetera. Anyway, she's also a really incredibly good mom. Her kids are performing really well. They're engaged. She's been engaged in school and studies, and just are really great kids. And she's been really diligent in thinking about how to support them and be there for them, especially during the pandemic. At the end of last month, something really tragic happened, however. When she was at work, she got really ill, and her coworkers noticed that she looked gravely ill. She was sweating profusely. She was slurring her words. She was confused. They were worried about a stroke or something else. And so they called the paramedics, and the paramedics took her into the hospital, and she was admitted for about 24 hours for observation, and a number of tests were run. The next morning, doctors and nurses came in and they said, well, we've ruled out some things, but the thing that we know was the driver, or the main issue that brought you in here, was really low blood sugar. looks like your blood sugars were very low to the point of causing all these really grave symptoms. Now, if you're like me, and like Mrs. M, you're probably first in the hospital room, with a gown on, with your butt kind of exposed in the back, and you're in a vulnerable situation. You're probably first and foremost thinking about your loved ones. In this case, for Mrs. M, her kids and her mom. How are they doing? And the doctors and nurses explain, oh, they're in the lobby, they're waiting for you. Once you're discharged, they're ready to take you home. They're really concerned. And then Mrs. M says, well, let me ask you the other question, which is, what happened? I don't get it. I have high blood sugar, and usually with my diabetes, how did I get blood sugar to be this low? This is weird. Did you find out what's going on here? What caused this? So in medicine, we're really good at actually looking at some of these, the answers for these questions in general, especially when it comes to looking at biological causes. Like when Mrs. M said, well, what caused this low blood sugar? We can say, well, we're really good at looking at things in your biology to explain this. Maybe there's some things you see in the green circle here. There's some things related to what's happening biologically with maybe there's an infection that we had to rule out, because sometimes infections cause real problems with how your blood sugar is metabolized. Maybe there's some problems with the interaction of medications, and that's what caused this. So we can run some tests to evaluate for that. We're pretty good at that. We're pretty good at looking at those biological root causes. We're getting better, I would also say, in the past 15 years, but we're not there yet at looking at behavioral causes. Maybe there was something in terms of how she's eating, taking care of herself, taking her medications, that it could explain what happened with her low blood sugar. Maybe this is the unmasking of an underlying depression with all that's going on in her life, and that depression is manifesting in lower abilities to kind of care for herself and take care of her kids, and be able to take care of her diabetes as well as she would otherwise want. So we're getting better at systematically, routinely screening for issues like depression and looking at behavioral causes. And again, we're not great at this in healthcare in general, but we're getting better at this, and it's a big part of what it means to provide the highest standard of care, to look at not just the biological, but also the behavioral root causes. What I think we're not really good at all, and I think we're starting to get really better and better at day by day, and this is where my work comes in specifically, is looking at not just the biological and the behavioral, but also the social factors like living and working conditions. What if it's not just about how she's eating and how she's sleeping, but where she's eating and where she's sleeping, and what's happening in her work and living conditions? Does she experience something known as food insecurity, for example, where a household doesn't have enough money at the end of a month to be able to afford enough food because they spent the money on rent and utilities and other expenses? And in fact, that's exactly what happened with Mrs. M. Mrs. M's story is a pretty common one, unfortunately, where in lower income diabetic adults like Mrs. M across the country tend to have a much higher rate of being hospitalized at the end of the month, not just calling a nurse advice line or looking up symptoms on Dr. Google, but being admitted to the hospital. There's almost a 30% higher risk of being admitted to the hospital at the end of each month for lower income diabetic adults compared to higher income diabetic adults. And that's because of food insecurity. Because again, Mrs. M is taking care of her mom and making sure the rent is paid and taking care of her mom's medications and her utilities and her rent and her kids' needs and feeding all of her family members. And then to be able to stretch the dollar a bit more, skipping meals for herself so that she can make sure everybody else is fed and all the other expenses are paid for. And by skipping those meals, but still taking her medications as prescribed, her blood sugar plummets. The blood sugar lowering medications that sometimes are prescribed for diabetes, she was taking, but without enough food in her belly to keep herself healthy, and hence the hospitalization. This story is a very common story, but as a field, as an industry in healthcare, we're not doing a great job with this power of upstream thinking and applying that systematically to be able to evaluate whether something as simple as an intervention to address food could help achieve the highest standard of care. Not just more medications and pharmaceuticals and other kinds of interventions, but also just basic things to improve these unmet social needs. What we found is that it starts with actually helping our partners, our clients, our kind of community understand what it means to move upstream. When we do this, we actually share a parable that I'm going to share with you right now. And I think it might resonate, I hope it does, at least with you in the open source community, as it does for us in healthcare. The parable goes as following. There are three friends who come to a river. It's a beautiful day. They want to do a picnic, but something really tragic happens. They see that there are people in the water, and the people in the water in front of them are being pulled by a strong tide towards a waterfall. It's dangerous. They're drowning. They're about to fall over the water's edge, and they're crying out for help. Three friends then do what all of us would do. They jump right in to help. First friend says, I'm going to save those who are about to drown. I'm going to save those, rescue those who are in dire straits. Second friend says, I'm going to swim a little further upstream and get the branches along the banks of the river here, get some twine, some rope, whatever I can find, and build a raft and maybe save people alongside my rescuer friend. For every one person that she rescues, I can save maybe 10 or 15 or 30 or 50, get them into a raft and usher them to safety. This so far, by the way, is a story of American healthcare, right? The rescuer, who's the trauma surgeon, the oncologist, the ICU nurse, the ER doctor. These are the people that you want when you're in dire straits, and we need them. And increasingly in healthcare, we have the raft builders, the primary care doctors, right? The people who can usher you to safety, who can provide the preventative screenings to keep you healthy and to keep you out of harm's way. But in our story, there are three friends, and our true friends who are in the water still rescuing and saving people and helping people recognize that sometimes the same people are in the water that they saw just the week before, and they say, what's going on here? There are some inequities going on. And so they shout out to the third friend, hey, where are you going? I mean, there's some people here to save, and there's some issues we're seeing here. And they shout to her friend, where are you going? Can you please help us out? And she shouts back, I know, I'm going to find out who or what is throwing these people in the water. That third friend is the upstreamist. The upstreamist is the term I use to describe the kind of person who works within their system in their particular industry to be able to address the root causes of what's causing problems and the inequities that are associated with those problems. It's not just enough to be able to treat and rescue. It's not enough just to be able to usher people to safety. We recognize in healthcare increasingly that it takes us the ability to identify root causes to be able to really make a dent in the problems that matter the most. When we talk about this story, we translate it into a definition. This definition is the way you see here. And the biggest takeaway is that when we talk about this in healthcare, we talk about this as a way to moving upstream as a way to address the social and the structural drivers of health equity, right, of outcomes that matter. And to do so at three levels: individual levels, like for patients like Mrs. M, community levels, and broader structural kind of levels. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. But when we share these stories, we do so for a reason, because we recognize in our space that the power of upstream thinking really starts with helping us to shift our mindset, to start to understand. Because if we don't understand a problem, right, we can't transform it. We can't transform and find the solutions. Here's an example of what I mean by kind of shifting our mindset. You guys have heard this adage, I'm sure. Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. It's so common, I think we take it for granted. This is just, makes total sense. It's got a lot of wisdom in this. The shift in mindset, though, the power of upstream thinking, the ability to look at root causes, though, challenges us to look at this adage, even this common kind of way of thinking, this paradigm, with a new fresh set of eyes. For example, okay, but why not teach a woman to fish? But what if the pond close to home is polluted? Or what if this man that you're trying to teach, or this woman and their family, have been historically denied access to the resources to fish in the first place? Rods, permits, tackle. These are kind of structural questions. This is what it means to actually interrogate the systems and the structures that behind a problem, and not just look at the problem itself and assume that it's just about better behavior, right? Better skills, as if that's sufficient to be able to address deeper structural kind of issues. This is a shift that is not easy for many to kind of wrap their heads around, but it's powerful and it's necessary, especially as we move upstream, as we think about how to solve some of the most intractable problems in our communities and in our industries. Moving upstream means the shift in mindset from describing effects to identifying root causes, from assuming behavior change is sufficient. Again, behavior change is vitally important, but behavior change is just part of the solution. The other part of it is changing the systems that shape those behaviors in the first place. So the shift in mindset, as you can see here, is really towards a more structural kind of analysis, the ability to understand root causes. And it's a big part of what it means to move upstream. It's the ability to actually be in a situation and start to recognize the structures and the systems underneath it, to be able to recognize sometimes when you're on the field and you're in your field and you're debating things that are on the field, or that are right in front of you. For example, on the soccer field, like in my field, where we focus a lot on certain quality measures and certain kind of healthcare outcomes and certain processes and clinics and hospitals. We're enmeshed in a lot of discussions about what's on our field, in our field. Same thing, I'm sure, for you guys. Moving upstream, the shift in mindset allows us to be able to recognize sometimes when the field itself is uneven and the structures that we're operating or playing on in this case. That's what it means to shift our mindset, to start to see the structures and the systems underlying the work that we're doing and not just react to the symptoms and the downstream effects of it. So shifting our mindset is a hard thing, but it's a necessary thing. And the second thing is to then translate that mindset, that thinking, into action. And what we see across the board for upstreamists is that they're able to, in healthcare, and this is true for other sectors, as I found, is that all upstreamists are able to identify problems and patterns of inequity first. Second, then identify the root causes of those problems and those inequities. And then third, be able to mobilize resources and work with others, both in their field and outside of their field, to address those root causes. So what does this mean for you? That's a question. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are, and looking forward to Tidelift's kind of conversations. But what does it mean to apply upstream thinking for the open source community when it comes to identifying a problem and a pattern of inequity, when it comes to identifying a root cause of that inequity, and then when it comes to mobilizing resources and moving at 3 different levels: individual, institutional, and societal? And I'm really curious to learn more from you about what this might look like in the open source community, what this might look like to think and then work in an upstream kind of way. Thank you so much to my friends at Tidelift. Thanks to all of you. Be well, and I'm always happy to collaborate in anything that you guys feel is important as well. Thank you.
Thanks again to Dr. Manchanda for that introduction to upstream thinking. Now, Dr. Manchanda asked, what does it mean to move upstream? And he shared that parable of 3 friends saving children who are drowning in a river. The first friend he compared to a frontline healthcare worker treating patients reactively in the emergency room. The second friend, the one building the raft, was trying to find solutions to treat those symptoms at a greater scale. But the third friend, the upstreamist, asked the basic question, who's throwing these kids in the river anyway? Why is this ER so crowded in the first place? So let's apply that mode of thinking to open source software and some of the challenges that we face. What are the downstream issues in open source today? What's the version of the ER that application development teams building with open source or open source maintainers are dealing with every day? Now, to start with, I'm optimistic about open source on all fronts. I mean, open source is totally amazing, and we've come so far from the early days of a sort of hobbyist dynamic to open source underlying our entire digital civilization. And if you work building software applications, open source software is already your de facto platform, and for good reason. But there are also some challenges that come along with using open source software. And when we've surveyed teams that are building with open source software, we hear that some of the challenges that hold them back in their use are around areas like security, licensing, and maintenance. Open source software can unlock amazing value for organizations of all kinds, but wielding it can be a little bit tricky sometimes. In another recent survey, we asked organizations that use open source to tell us how they think they're doing in terms of covering these security, licensing, and maintenance challenges. And what we heard is that they don't feel that they're doing great. In fact, almost half of the respondents told us that they're not very or not at all confident that they're covering these attributes of their open source software that they're using. And only 16% felt very confident in their use of open source software. That means at least 84% are somewhat concerned about how they're using open source software and how they're governing its use. And frankly, there are some good reasons to be guarded. Software supply chain security broadly is an increasingly important issue. Just over the last couple of months, we've been reading on the front page of newspapers about attacks like the one that used the SolarWinds products as a supply chain attack, and other recent attacks on critical infrastructure, including energy, food, and transportation systems. And increasingly, those attacks are using the software that these organizations rely on as an entry point. Now, open source software is still software. It's not immune to security vulnerabilities. And in some ways, open source is even trickier to address, especially at scale, given it's so broad and permeable by its very nature. Now, national governments have noticed this issue as well. Just a few weeks ago in the US, the White House issued an executive order on cybersecurity that requires those doing business with the US government to begin vouching for the security and provenance or source of the software that goes into their solutions. The executive order on cybersecurity specifically calls out open source software as an area that needs to be dealt with. And while this order applies to the government and its agencies directly, it's going to have knock-on effects in industry because so many commercial companies do business with the US federal government. Increasingly, this is going to be the new standard for cybersecurity. And if you're part of one of those 84% of organizations that's not entirely confident in your use of open source software, it's time to start thinking ahead to what you're going to do about it. Now let's look at it from the perspective of the creators and maintainers of open source software. So this XKCD webcomic poignantly illustrates the challenge here. A lot is resting on the shoulders of independent open source maintainers. I mean, the world relies on their work, but most of them are part-time volunteers. In fact, we just talked to a bunch of these open source maintainers in the context of our first ever Tidelift maintainer survey, and I want to share a few of the key findings from that survey with you. So the first finding, surprising to some or but not to others, is that almost half, 46% of open source maintainers get paid nothing for their work on open source today. Only about a quarter of the maintainers make more than $1,000 a year for their open source work. And another quarter are just making pizza money for maintaining the software that the whole world depends on. And maintainers don't like the fact that they're not getting paid for this work. In fact, their top dislike about being an open source maintainer, that we learned in our survey, is that they're not being paid for their efforts. But there are also other things that are undesirable about this activity. For example, they find it extremely stressful when the world is depending on their software and they're trying to cover all the bases as a side hustle. And they feel underappreciated and that their work is thankless. By the way, they also feel like the work is too demanding, that it's lonely. They report that what was once fun now feels like work. You can see where this is going. Okay, so those are some of the issues that we face as users and creators of open source software. So how can we apply this upstream thinking model to addressing these challenges? How can we make open source work better for everyone? So let's apply Dr. Manchanda's upstream thinking framework to this problem domain. Here's a recap of what Dr. Manchanda suggested earlier regarding how to apply upstream thinking. First, identify the problems and patterns of inequity. Second, identify their root causes. And third, mobilize resources and work together at all levels to address those root causes. So step one, we've already been talking about some of these issues that both development teams and the maintainers behind open source face. Development teams love using open source, but they worry about keeping it secure, up-to-date, and well-maintained. And meanwhile, those maintainers are exhausted and stressed out trying to do their part to help. So let's go to step two, identify the root causes. Most maintainers didn't sign up to be part of a bunch of organizations' software supply chain in the first place. And maintainers just aren't being compensated for the value of the work that they do. And that means that they can't spend as much time and energy as they would like, and really as all of us who depend on their software would like, to keep that software in tip-top shape. As a result, we're all exposed to this increasing drumbeat of security and maintenance issues that really threaten the foundations of our digital civilization. And the existing solutions that we've had in hand are really all about treating the symptoms. They're the equivalent of the emergency room treatment, looking at just putting band-aids on things. I mean, having a tool that analyzes your application as you're putting it to production, that throws some flags about potentially problematic software components, yeah, that's helpful on the margin, but it's not a way to scalably address this challenge. It's treating symptoms, not solving the problem at the source. And this daily drumbeat of new security issues, supply chain attacks, these overwhelming reports that are getting spit out of container and application scanning products, it's really overwhelming and it's not solving the problem. So can we apply this upstream thinking approach to fix this problem at the source? That's step three, and this is where you come in. Mobilizing resources and working together to address these root causes. And that's why we're here at Upstream today, to take this day to celebrate all of the things that are amazing about open source, to say thank you to the open source maintainers who create this amazing software that we all rely on and maintain it from day to day, and to prompt a dialogue about what we might do to make open source work even better for everyone. Now, I want to seed a couple of ideas that we've been working on, some upstream solutions that we as a community might be able to rally around to get us out of this urgent care, emergency room mode and address more of these root causes of these challenges in open source software communities. So a first idea, and this is not rocket science, how about we pay the maintainers of open source? It's obviously the right thing to do given the amount of value that they're contributing to our society, but it also just makes good business sense. I mean, if we pay the maintainers of open source software, everybody gets what they want. The upstream maintainers get paid so they can spend their time on this valuable work, and downstream users and organizations of all kinds get software that meets certain defined standards so they know they can depend on it. If you think about it, many billion-dollar companies have been built on open source software. So why aren't maintainers in a position to participate in some of the value that they're helping to create? Now here's the second idea. If you think back to Dr. Manchanda's presentation, he had this image of a soccer pitch tilted like this in one direction. Unfortunately, that's the way open source looks for a lot of potential contributors. And if maintenance is a volunteer activity that's only available to the privileged, that means it's not accessible to broad swaths of the population who could otherwise help. For example, those who have aging parents or children to care for, or have to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. To Dr. Manchanda's point, let's think about what we could do to enable more diverse contributors to open source communities. And by the way, maintainers agree that this would be very valuable. In fact, 69% agree that open source would benefit from more contributor diversity, and only 9% disagreed with that in our recent Tidelift maintainer survey. We also asked maintainers specifically what they thought might help increase this diversity of contributions. 3/4 said just creating a welcoming atmosphere would help a lot. 60% said making efforts in the areas of community onboarding and outreach, and more than half thought that additional mentorship opportunities could move the meter here. So there's some pretty straightforward opportunities if we focus on these diligently. Now just step back for a second and imagine a world where organizations can get healthier, more secure, and more robust open source software to build whatever their applications are with, and where maintainers are rewarded for the incredible value that they create, and which in turn can increase the quantity and diversity of people who have incentives to contribute to open source, and to ensure that those creations remain secure both today and into the future. To my mind, that's the upstream way that we can make open source work better for everyone. Thanks for joining us today at Upstream. And remember, open source is amazing, but we can make it even better by working together. Thank you.